All right, here we go. A review that's on time because the brand's not afraid of it. The 9060 XT 16GB card. Anyway, yes, there is an 8GB version. AMD gets the same treatment as NVIDIA. That should not exist. Anyway, we're gonna compare the $349 9060 XT 16GB versus the 5060 8GB card, which is technically a $299. And I say technically now because guess what? We already did the video about the 5060 a few days ago, as you guys already saw, and we showed at the time that there was the only MSRP model, which is the Prime that I have right here at $299. Micro Center showed that they had some, they're gone. And not only are they gone, they're gone for good. Like including out of stock items doesn't show up anymore. People can't really be running out and buying these, right? For those looking for a high-end custom gaming experience, look no further than Falcon Northwest. Falcon Northwest has been building PCs made for gamers for over 30 years with a focus on a true high-end gaming experience. Custom cases available only through Falcon Northwest feature state-of-the-art testing and design to ensure that every component is performing at their best through thermal imaging and rigorous lab testing designed and overseen by the Falcon Northwest founder himself. With a complete lineup of systems ranging from small to large, every Falcon Northwest system includes a 3-year warranty policy and a year of 2-way overnight shipping coverage, providing the ultimate peace of mind. To see all that Falcon Northwest has to offer, follow the sponsored link in the description below. All right, anyway, this isn't about the 5060, that's just what we're kind of comparing to the 9060 XT because these two are within price parity of each other. So this is the 9060 XT Reaper model, which is an MSRP model. It's from Power Color. It is a very small, very compact 2-fan design. It uses a single 8-pin PCI Express. Obviously, we're comparing it to the MSRP, I guess it was MSRP, 5060 Prime, which is a non-TI model, and it's an 8GB card because the 5060 only gets the 8GB treatment. It's funny, it's like, I don't feel like there should even be a treatment when it comes to the Power Color or the 9060 XT because it should only be a 16GB card, just like I feel the 5060 should only be a 16GB card, just like I feel every card moving forward in the future should be a 16GB or greater card. But anyway, that's in a perfect world. Let's do this. Let's go and talk about specs real quick. And then I have obviously put the 9060 XT through all of our testing. This round versus the 5060, I told you I didn't do like generational performance improvements when it comes to looking at things like power draw and temperatures and all that sort of stuff, because I really saved it for against the 9060 XT. Because I really think right now it's really more relevant to anyone looking to buy a brand new entry-level GPU. I say entry-level because there is nothing high-end, there's nothing even mid-end for these cards as far as I'm concerned. This is now the buy-in price point, which is anywhere between $300 and $350, which is crazy because we should have $200 to $250 models that exist at these performance figures. So that just shows how much the pricing scale has scooted up, where the performance scale has stayed down towards the bottom. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about specs right here. The 9060 XT is on Navi 44. It's RDNA 4, obviously. It's a 4nm FinFET technology with 29.7 billion transistors. It's a monolithic. It's funny that they have to state that because AMD, as you know, does like to do more chiplet type designs, and their GPUs are no exception. A lot of the GPUs that you see from them in the future are going to be a chiplet type of design. Architecture-wise, the GB206 for the 5060. It is also a 5nm/4N FinFET architecture, so they are very similar in that aspect. 21.9 billion transistors. Interestingly enough, though, this is running 8GB of GDDR7, whereas the 16GB and 8GB models of the 9060 XTs are still on GDDR6. So that only strengthens my argument that there should absolutely not be an 8GB model, and because it's running GDDR6, which has been around for years now, there's no reason to have to charge $50 more for it. Unfortunately, this is AMD still following the suit of the yellow brick road, or I should say the green brick road at this point that NVIDIA has paved, telling AMD, hey, guess what? Buyers are suckers, they'll buy anything, so you can just charge more for it. And I think a lot of people have already expressed their disappointment that AMD, rather than kind of pushing back against that and saying, let's give the greatest value we can while giving the highest technology and the highest performance we can per dollar, they're just like, hey, we can get away with charging more because look, NVIDIA fanboys are doing it. Why wouldn't AMD fanboys do it? So unfortunately, it's not all RGB and rainbows when it comes to in fact, there's no RGB on either of these cards. But anyway, I digress. It's not all RGB and rainbows when it comes to AMD because unfortunately they've shown that they're willing to squeeze every penny out of you guys as well. Anyway, moving on to the rest of the specs, it is the 9060 XT is a 160 watt card, whereas the 5060 is a 145 watt card. So they are very similar when it comes to their power draw. No surprise there. These are fairly small, efficient designs. Let's go ahead and jump right into the benchmarks because so neither of these cards are designed for 4K. You should really never be considering 4K gaming with these cards, period. There's absolutely no reason for that to be the case. But what I will say is that I did 4K testing on both of these cards, even though I didn't show 4K in the 5060, I only showed a handful of them. I did test 4K with both of these cards, not as an indicator of how good they are at 4K gaming, just putting a very difficult load on the cards to see how far they sort of separate out when it comes to their architectures, as well as showing that 16 gigabyte frame buffer is important when it comes to future games, even when we talk about 1440p. So when it comes to speedway, there's no surprise that the 5060 beats out the 9060 XT simply because of the fact that NVIDIA is still an entire generation ahead on their RT core design. So it's a 3488 versus a 2925. Now, obviously ray tracing is only part of the story because as soon as you start looking at rasterization or raster performance, which is just straight up using those stream processors / CUDA cores, shaders, whatever you want to call them, it really paints a different story because they nearly perfectly flip their position by putting the 9060 XT on top at 7337 versus a 6425 on our Times by Extreme score. If we go ahead and take a look at F1 1080p, this is where you start to see some, depending on the title, some pretty big separation between the two. So the 9060 XT gives us an average 1080p frames per second at 101.7 versus 80.2 for the 5060. So as you can see, even in 1080p, a big jump in performance of the 9060 XT over the 5060. Going up to 1440, same exact story, a 73.8 average FPS for the 9060 versus a 59.9 or barely a 60 FPS for the 5060. If we go ahead and move on now to Black Myth Wukong, I want to point this out. This is a very heavily NVIDIA biased title. We use this title because we also use the very heavily AMD biased title of Borderlands. So it kind of shows you, depending on the games you want to play and depending on the developer influence by the manufacturer in NVIDIA versus AMD and the money they're willing to throw at the studio, will sometimes determine the type of performance that you get. Unfortunately, those politics absolutely do exist when it comes to gaming. So the 5060 is giving us a 65.8 average FPS in Black Myth versus a 45.1 when it comes to the 9060 XT. So we're talking 30% less performance for the AMD card versus NVIDIA with this title. Now in 1440p, same story, the 5060 Prime gets a 44.3 average FPS versus the 9060 XT's 29.9. Again, very heavily NVIDIA biased title. If you just look at our charts, you can see that. Almost the whole top of the chart is NVIDIA with a couple of, like 9000 series, like 9070 XT actually does pretty well versus like the 7000 series when it comes to the old Navi architecture. But you can see the bottom half of that chart is heavily AMD. Now, if we go ahead and flip the script to Borderlands, which is a very heavy AMD title, you can see our 9060 XT Reaper is giving us a 140.3 average FPS. It's an older title. It runs very well even on lower end hardware, especially AMD hardware. But the 5060 Prime is getting a 115.7. So a 140 versus a 115. If we go and go to 1440p, same exact story, 96.3 average FPS for the 9060 XT versus 80.5 for the Prime. Now, if we take a look at some of the cards that are in the vicinity though of the 9060, even when it comes to Borderlands, like a 4070 FE is the next range up. So you move from a 96.3 to a 105.4 for the 4070. Now, obviously, arguably a 4070 costs significantly more than the Reaper card. So that just kind of shows, depending on the title, sometimes, you know, there is that, unfortunately, those politics that are involved. Let's move on to Avatar. Avatar is a title that definitely favors high-end cards. It doesn't really matter if it's AMD or NVIDIA. It's just if you've got a lower-end card, this title definitely can bring your GPUs to their knees. In fact, these cards are very, very similar in performance when it comes to that. So the 5060 and 1080p at Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is an 80.6 versus a 77.4 for the 9060 XT. In 1440p, same story, 54.0 versus a 52.4. In fact, if you look at the 5% and 1% lows, they're very similar in these cards too. So it really just shows like the higher end card, the better when it comes to Avatar. But I do like this title because if you look at the 1% and 5% lows, they scale very, very well as you move across the card stack. So Cyberpunk 2077, this is a ray trace medium preset. This is for us testing things like, because rasterization as well as ray tracing turned on with the title. The Reaper edged out a completely indistinguishable 57.8 versus a 56.6 for the 5060. To me, that's actually showing how impressive the RT improvement for AMD has been since it started RT back with the 6000 series GPUs and then 7000 series, and now obviously we're in the 9000 series, which is showing a huge gap narrowing when it came to those. In fact, back in the day, if you compared a 6000 series card to like a 3080 or whatever, right? If you talked about like a 6950 XT versus a 3080, it was crazy, the gap as soon as you turned on ray tracing. The ray tracing performance was just absolutely terrible. But now they're really close and in fact indistinguishable when it comes to the same tier level of these cards. So same thing in 1440p. The Reaper's barely faster than it at a 35.5 versus a 34.4. And the 5% and 1% lows are very consistent with these cards. They stay very, very similar. So if Cyberpunk's one of those titles that you want to play, very, very difficult to distinguish the two of them from each other. All right, so talking about Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl, very close together as well. So the 9060 XT is at a 65.9 versus a 63.2 for the 5060. Now, one thing I kind of want to point out there is you'll notice some significantly higher 5% and 1% lows with the 9060 XT versus the 5060. So I didn't really mention 5%, 1% lows on the other titles because they were pretty much in line. If one had a better average on the FPS, then they also had better 5 and 1% lows. This one's kind of a different story. So if you look at the chart, you'll see 61.1, 5% low versus 65.5 for the 5060, and then 57.6 for the 9060 versus 48.7 for the 1%. So a fairly significant performance and percentage increase on those lows versus the average. Now, if we take a look at 1440p, same sort of thing, but again, actually very, very indistinguishable if you want to know the truth. We get the 5060 at 47.6 and the 9060 at 47.3. And their 1% and 5% lows are essentially within 1 to 2 FPS of each other. So really kind of narrowed when it came to 1440p, which is kind of interesting. But it's funny because we already showed you with the 5060 review that the 5060 couldn't even launch and run Stalker 2 at 4K and get anything more than 2 FPS average. That's simply because it doesn't have a big enough frame buffer for that title, and the way that that title requests and demands frame buffer, it's just, at that point, this title's become fun just to see, will it run when it comes to lower end cards. Now I want to talk about 4K real quick. As I've already said, 4K is not a resolution you should ever consider running with these cards whatsoever. But in our instance here, we're using them as a stress test, like a true stress test, and a frame buffer test, if you will. So you're gonna notice, kind of on average, depending on the title, the Reaper pulls way ahead of the 5060, and that is because of the frame buffer. Even though it is running memory that is essentially half the speed of the 5060, it has a massive amount of RAM available to it, which is more important than RAM speed if you need a big frame buffer. So looking at F1 2024 4K, the 9060 gets 41.4 average FPS in 4K versus the 5060's 28.9. So it's pretty gross, actually, when you compare it. If we move over to Black Myth Wukong 4K, again, the title is very heavily NVIDIA favored. So a 23.6 when it comes to the 5060 versus a 15 flat for the 9060 XT. So yeah, that's one of those things where sometimes the horsepower just can't overcome the optimizations on a specific color, whether it be green or red, because when we move over to Borderlands, it's the same sort of thing. So we got a 50.7 for the 9060 XT versus a 41.2 for the 5060. Frontiers, Avatar, Frontiers of Pandora, essentially identical numbers, which is kind of crazy, especially since we do run averages for these cards and multiples of runs. So it's funny that they're nearly identical. 27.9 versus 27.9. 5% low is 25.2 versus 25.1, and 1% low at 24.2 versus 23.9. So it's essentially a wash when it comes to Frontiers of Pandora. Really, it just favors horsepower. Cyberpunk 2077 4K, 9060 XT Reaper at 16.1. Again, RT, very difficult title to run, versus a 13.2 And then Stalker, we actually got a 26.1 FPS at 90 for the 9060 XT versus the 5060's 2.2. Again, the 5060 never even stood a chance. The menu gets laggy when you enable 4K at the epic settings that we're running right now with our benchmarks. So that just shows how much frame buffer matters. Now again, it doesn't matter in this instance because you should not be running 4K for these cards whatsoever, but it's just interesting that we have finally found a scenario at which a card and its frame amount and a title will not basically run. And you can see all those zeros on the chart right there. Those cards that have 0 were so bad, we could not even start the test. You would push forward on the keyboard and the thing would just not go. You might get one motion blurred frame and then you're waiting 10 seconds for it to render the next frame. It's nuts. So in fact, some of them wouldn't even like run at all. Like as soon as you got into the game, it was just like lock up. So that's that Stalker 4K, Stalker 2 4K is for us basically nothing more than a dynamometer at its max load just to see what would happen. All right, so let's take a look at some interesting things now, like temperatures and such. So if we talk about Furmark just doing a max temperature test on the GPUs, it should be no surprise that the 5060 runs overall cooler, quite a bit cooler actually than the 9060 XT, because it is a triple fan cooler versus a dual fan cooler. This has a massive heatsink versus this. This essentially has like double the amount of cooling if you think about the heatsink density as well. So the 5060 caps out in that test right around 60C. It's kind of funny, the 9060 XT initially peaks pretty high up to over 65C, but that's because of the 0 dB mode. Both these cards have 0 dB mode, but it's kind of slow to react. By the time the fans come on and start ramping up, the temperature has to come back down. So it gives you this weird kind of a bump and then a trend line that starts to go up where it's reaching about 68C on average. So that's not terrible. But it's just obvious that this card is going to be able to stay cooler because it's slightly less wattage and it's a bigger cooler. Now, if we take a look at memory test though, this is where it's a little disappointing for this exact card, the Reaper. Now, this is not a 9060 XT thing. This is now a power color thing, the way they've implemented their cooler onto the board. Memory junction temperature on the 5060 caps out at pretty much exactly 70 degrees. However, the Reaper does bump into the 90s. So for a card that's such low power, it's a bit disappointing that it actually is not keeping the memory cool whatsoever, because as I look at it, I'm not gonna do a teardown on this card right now, but I can tell you what's happened is you got the cold plate on top of the die, and then it just has this thin copper piece that extends to where the RAM is. So you're getting that very slow transfer of heat through a thin piece of copper before it gets to the heatsink. The difference between the Asus and the power color card is the heat pipes extend over to where the RAM is and then comes up. So that heat can go up through that copper plate right into the heat pipe, whereas on the Reaper, the heat pipe is only touching the die. So that's why the temperatures kind of suck for the memory on the Reaper. Now that's in Furmark. If we take a look at Cyberpunk, which is an actual game to compare the temperatures, you can see once again the GPU for the Reaper, the 9060 XT, is reaching 70C and still somewhat climbing even after 10 minutes. The temperatures on the 5060 are kind of all over the place. Like, it's kind of funny. And the reason for that is because it's such a low wattage card that it's actually hitting the power limit so hard that it does this kind of a quick reaction to bring the temp and the power limit back down. So that's why you see on the lower end cards all this zigzagginess on NVIDIA's side versus this card is not hitting those power limits quite so hard because it's a slightly higher wattage. But if we go ahead and move on to memory temp in the game, in Cyberpunk, same sort of story. I mean, they're only hitting about 85C versus 90 versus Furmark, but that's still really hot for the memory on a card that's not doing a whole lot versus like, I mean, we were seeing 90s on the 5090 Founders Edition card and that was too hot for a lot of people. I agree, it's still too hot in this instance as well, but you can see that the 5060's memory is hitting about 62.5C, jumping between 60 and 62.5C. So Asus does a much better job on the Prime keeping the memory cool versus the power color. Last but not least, let's go ahead and talk about power. It's kind of interesting when we look at the power on the 9060 XT though versus the 5060. So you can see the 9060 is bouncing all around between 155 to about 165 watt. Just because it's a 160 watt card doesn't mean it'll stop right there perfectly. We measure this at the cables and the PCI slot. That way we can see what the true power draw is. It fluctuates exactly as you would expect when looking at a game, and this is Cyberpunk 2077 right here. But you've got all kinds of curves and stuff happening with the 5060. This is normal behavior that we've seen on low-end cards from NVIDIA, because when they're set as low as 145 watts, but they can still boost up to 2800 megahertz, you see this fluctuation all the time because the power is going to fluctuate with the frequency. Speaking of frequency, if we take a look at frequency, it's very strange, to be honest. The 9060 XT has a heartbeat. It's like literally alive. It's the first time I've ever actually seen what looks like an actual heartbeat in a frequency. Now you got to keep in mind, the 9060 XT's design is to boost to over 3100 megahertz if the parameters are there to allow it to boost that high, which usually would mean not a 100% load. So as we're sitting there in Cyberpunk, obviously that load is kind of changing, and because of it, we get very big swings of all the way down to 2700 megahertz and all the way up to over 3000 megahertz for just a split second. So that's why we get this weird kind of a heartbeat. And I'm assuming we're seeing the interval like that because as we're sitting there in the game, things that are happening around are kind of triggering either the frequencies to go up or down depending on the power draw. Now the 5060, as you can see, is a very straight line right around that 2750 megahertz mark because that is the max boost clock for this card. So it's the first time I've seen this kind of a crazy heartbeat when it comes to the 9060 XT. However, if you look at the overall averages and 5% lows and 1% lows on the 9060 XT, on the charts, when we looked at the gaming charts, you can see this weird heartbeat behavior doesn't actually affect the overall performance of the game. It's just a very dynamic clock, allowing itself to adjust quite a bit. I mean, we're talking like over 400 megahertz of swing versus where it can go versus where it really lands in a real world scenario. And remember, 160 watts allowed to a card, available to a card that's able to go up to like 3130 megahertz on the boost clock. That's kind of crazy, to be honest, to try and get those frequencies at that power limit. So that's why you see this craziness happen when it comes to these lower end cards. Speaking of craziness that's happening, I'm gonna say it again. This should be a $299 card for 16 gigabytes of GDDR6. And if you really, really wanted to just drive a nail into that entry-level buyer, that person that, like the 60 series or tier cards on NVIDIA, they've always touted is their biggest sellers because they hit the biggest part of the market of people looking to spend around $300 for a graphics card. These guys are spending over $400 now to buy one today. If you launched a card that is arguably faster on average across our titles at the same price, why on earth would you buy the card that's slower for the same price? What's hurting it is the fact that it's $50 more MSRP than the 5060. And what those prices are really going to be once they hit the market, because again, they're not on shelves yet. We're filming this before they launch. It's just sad to see them copying a model that NVIDIA is getting destroyed over. So if AMD wants to know what their future looks like, pay attention, because you're kind of skipping down that same road and you're gonna skip right off the cliff if you're not careful. And I'm gonna say this again. For the love of God, please make a 9080 XT. You've already proved the 9070 XT is phenomenal. Micro Center told me, like the employees at Micro Center told me, they're selling 4 9070 XTs for every one NVIDIA card. Could you imagine if you could build a card that is able to just walk all over a 4080 and a 5080, but it's cheaper? Please do it. Please take the success you're experiencing and roll back your statement saying you're not interested in competing on the high-end market, because I think you're onto something. All right, time to go. Thanks for watching, guys. Sound off down below if you're shopping at this $300 to $350 price point. Which one are you going with?